nature-based solutions, which one of my favorite terms, and I credit Steve Long, one of our speakers, with coming up with it, and it just is a great way to really explain what the policy is. They're critical as we strive to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Nature-based solutions can provide up to a third of the emission reductions needed by 2030, as required by the Next Generation RoadMap law, can boost jobs and protect our communities. And tonight we're going to learn about nature-based solutions, the potential they have in Massachusetts, updates on Massachusetts environmental state policy, including, of course, the Next Generation RoadMap law, and much more. Our two guest speakers tonight from the Nature Conservancy are Steve Long, Director of Government Relations, and Laura Marks, Forest Ecologist. And a little bit of background, hopefully a lot of folks are already familiar with the Nature Conservancy, but it's a global environmental nonprofit that has impacted conservation in 72 countries and territories with a mission to conserve the lands and waters in which all life depends. This webinar will feature these two guest speakers who I mentioned and share their expertise on nature-based solutions, updates on Massachusetts environmental policy, and things you can do in your community and how to effectively advocate with municipal government. And the community piece, I think, is critical because I'm really hopeful that this nature-based solutions provisions in the law is something that local environmental groups, conservation trusts, climate change organizations, groups like Green Action, Green Hudson in my district, what can they do to use these provisions to better protect open space and do their part even more to combat climate change. Steve Long, I'll do my introduction, delivers groundbreaking solutions to the challenges of tackling climate change and conserving natural resources by influencing public policy and securing funding. We've worked together for many years, and he has led advocacy campaigns in Massachusetts by collaborating with diverse stakeholders to enable the investment of billions of dollars in prioritized nature-based solutions. Laura Marks works on a wide range of environmental policy, forest science, and conservation work. Much of this work aims to increase the use of nature climate solutions, actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon storage in forests, farms, and wetlands. And she also leads the 4 states Green Mountains to Hudson Highlands linkage partnership, which works to protect the wildlife corridor that stretches from southern Vermont to northwestern Connecticut. Laura has a PhD in forest ecology from Michigan State University. After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A session. We already have a few questions from some of the folks already here in the webinar, which I'll be asking first, and then I'll be asking further questions. So looking forward to the conversation, and now I will hand it off to Steve Long. And thanks again to Steve and to Laura for presenting tonight with all your expertise and advocacy.
Steve, you're on mute.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Senator Eldridge. It's been great collaborating with you over time, and seeing you embrace nature-based solutions, seeing you lead on things like the water infrastructure law and this next-gen climate bill. And it's great collaborating with your wonderful staff too. Seeing Immaculate here, and also Simon, who I've known since he was born. But I'm going to pass it over to Laura, who will start, and then we are going to take turns during the presentation. So Laura.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. And I echo Steve's thanks, Senator Eldridge. Thank you for having us here. And thanks to those of you who joined on a gorgeous spring evening to learn a little bit more about this. So Steve, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So as Senator Eldridge mentioned in the intro, the Nature Conservancy is an international nonprofit conservation organization. We work in all 50 states and over 70 countries around the world. And we work on many things. We protect the lands and waters upon which all life depends, and that includes acting to solve climate change, because that is a threat to all of that work as well as to all of us. Now, if you're here today, I don't need to remind you that it's a climate crisis, climate emergency. People are literally changing the terms with which they use to describe climate change. But fortunately, we know how to solve it. And solving climate change or the climate crisis requires doing three things at once. We need to reduce emissions. We need to reduce our use of fossil fuels and get onto clean energy. We need to remove emissions, and we need to build resilience, adapt to these emissions. And that center and last phase, and Steve, it's possible if you didn't hit space that you have timings on, which you might want to just check if you didn't do those yellow things. What Steve and I are gonna focus on today is that piece of removing emissions, fossil fuel, greenhouse gas emissions that have already been put into the air as climate pollution, and also that idea of building resilience. But again, we work on all three of these in our day-to-day work. And Steve, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. So these terms can be challenging, and there's actually a whole other wrinkle when you go internationally, because people use nature-based solutions in the way that we use natural climate solutions here. So I just wanted to start just to describe that nature-based solutions, to my mind, are using nature to solve a problem. You can use nature to clean your water, clean drinking water. You can use it to increase your resilience to storms, to sort of block storm surges on the coast. You can use it to solve public health problems, right? Nature therapy is a whole thing now. A subset of nature-based solutions is natural climate solutions. And that's what Steve and I are really going to focus on today, is that subset of nature-based solutions that really get at removing and reducing carbon emissions. And you'll hear us again and again come back to this triad of protect, manage, and restore. Steve, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. So natural climate solutions are ways to protect, restore, and better manage our forests, farms, and wetlands to reduce and/or remove carbon emissions. Next slide, please. And around the world, natural climate solutions have an enormous potential to do this. So globally, natural climate solutions are estimated to be able to reduce or remove 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And that is, as the senator mentioned, about a third globally of what needs to be done to meet our Paris climate change agreements. There's a couple things I want to draw your attention to in this slide. The first is that at the top, you see that that clean energy part of the circle is bigger than the nature part. As powerful as nature is as a tool to address climate change, the biggest thing that we need to do is to stop using fossil fuels and to get on to clean energy. And it's important to remember that, because while natural climate solutions are a really hopeful and exciting part of the story, they don't get us off the hook for making those really difficult choices and policies to reduce our use of fossil fuels. The second thing I want to point out is at the bottom, you see a couple examples of those natural climate solutions, like protecting forest land, managing our croplands so that there's more carbon in soil and less nutrient runoff, restoring wetlands and reducing nutrient pollution so that we don't degrade the ones that we have. And you can find a lot more out about this at natureforclimate.org, which has explainer videos and scientific papers and case studies and anything you could want to learn more about with natural climate solutions. Now, here in Massachusetts, the natural climate solutions contribution is small but mighty. We estimate that natural climate solutions can reduce or remove 1 to 2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. Next slide, please. And I don't want to go too far in this presentation without saying something that also is probably obvious to most of us, but is worth repeating. And that is that climate change is fundamentally unjust. So whether you look at the global scale or however you scale down, in general, those who have the least responsibility for emitting carbon and causing the problem in the first place often face the greatest impacts. Now, natural climate solutions carbon benefits are felt globally. So if I sequester, pull down, remove from the atmosphere a ton of carbon here in Massachusetts, that benefits everyone around the world. But there are other benefits to natural climate solutions that are felt more locally. And those include greater air quality, clean drinking water, homes for all kinds of biodiversity, native plants and animals, even better, more fertile soil. So as we think about investing in these natural climate solutions, we need to really be sure that we're investing in those that directly benefit Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And Steve and I have been using a phrase that we come back to every once in a while, that idea that there is a role for every acre to play here as we think about these. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Steve to talk about the first part of that triad, the protect part of natural climate solutions.
The base of the hierarchy, that three-part hierarchy, or to manage and restore. The preferred option, because when carbon lost, you lose natural working land, and it's essentially irreparable. It cannot be regained, even if we intensive management and restoration. There's about a 30-year hiatus. So protecting natural and working lands doesn't mean that we're stopping forestry or agriculture. It doesn't mean that we're stopping development of natural and working lands, but rather using careful planning and low impact development to minimize that loss wherever possible. And land, it's like you're making an investment. Land protected now will yield dividends in the future. So the sequestration accrues over time through 2030, 2040, and 2050 and beyond. So we just wanted to highlight some actions you can take. So there are two pieces of legislation right now that are live. One is sponsored by our very own Senator Eldridge. It is the No Net Loss Bill. This is a bill that makes sure that when conservation land is converted, that conservation land is offered in replacement. And there's a movement afoot to broaden that definition of no net loss to cover farms and forests. Another piece of legislation is the conservation land tax credit. That provides incentives to private landowners to do the right thing on their land, whether it's protecting it for wildlife or conserving for agriculture or forestry. It provides a nice sweetener for a private landowner. And that's most of our forest land is privately owned. Then at the local level, you can work to protect and acquire land. You can work with your municipality, you can work with your land trust, and there's a huge suite of state funding and services available to help you do that. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is federal money that comes to Massachusetts that protects land for wildlife. It protects it for parks, for active recreation, and there are the land and the park grants, both which focus on rural and urban communities. And then there's other programs too, Conservation Partnership and the Landscape Partnership grants. And I'm going to turn it back to Laura.
Thanks, Steve. So this this slide is just a reminder to me as much as to anything else that the forests that I'm going to talk about in the manage and restore parts of that triad, these forests fight climate change in many ways. And as Steve just mentioned, it's critically important that we don't lose these forests. If we lose them, we can't argue about how to manage them or think about whether or not they're good sites for restoration. And we're happy to share this with people who are interested in it. It's just sort of a shorthand way to show some of those different ways that forests and urban trees and wood all play a role. So Steve, if you could go to the next slide. So in terms of land management, I'm just using a forest-based example here. So one natural climate solution is improved forest management. And sometimes improved forest management implies to people that the current management isn't good. That's not what it means. It's really about thinking about carbon as one of the primary values that's driving your management. You guys have a great organization based right here in your district, Senator, the New England Forestry Foundation, and they actually refer to this as exemplary management to sort of point out this is going above and beyond. And improved forest management can look like a lot of things. It can include forest reserves where you set aside forests and you don't do commercial timber harvesting, and they can store carbon for centuries. You can see in this picture on the left, we've got some really big trees, but we've also got small trees. We've got every age and size class growing back there. There's also a big tree down on the ground adding carbon to the soil. So that's one part of improved forest management. Another is carefully managing forests for many values, including timber. And so on the right here, I have a building some of you may have visited. This is the Olver Design Building at UMass Amherst. And it was designed using a lot of wood to substitute for more fossil fuel intensive concrete and steel. It's also gorgeous if you have the chance to visit it. And there's another real showcase of a building at the Walden Pond Visitor Center, which might be a little closer for some of you. I've listed here some community partners because with improved forest management, there's sort of a big difference in when people ask, what can I do? It sort of depends. Do you own and manage land, or are you asking as more someone who's interested who doesn't own land? If you are lucky enough to own a forest, or you work with a land trust that owns a forest, or your town forest, there's a lot of resources, including a list of forestry and conservation professionals on the UMass Amherst Extension website, which is masswoods.net. And the Nature Conservancy and many other partners, including the US Forest Service, have just developed a list of carbon beneficial forestry practices. We're finishing up the carbon modeling on those now, and we'll have a document out that will be much more user-friendly than the list I could send you now that'll be out this summer. And if you don't own forest land, there's still a lot of ways you can get involved. You can think about buying local wood if you're doing a project in your house. You can read up on these issues, and especially on the idea that we need sort of a range of types of management, a range of age classes and forest types across the landscape. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Steve. On the restore side, the example I'm going to give here is city tree planting. And we are really lucky in Massachusetts to have one of the best examples of a successful city tree planting program. It's called Greening the Gateway Cities, and it's run by the Mass Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, as well as the Department of Conservation and Recreation. One of the really cool things about this program is that they think very carefully about where to put the trees. They are bringing them into frontline communities, usually environmental justice neighborhoods, where the canopy cover is lower than nearby areas that are more affluent. And they've also tackled some of the challenges that these programs tend to face. So this program actually plants quite large trees. They're over 6 feet tall when they go into the ground. So they're not tiny little stick trees. And at the bottom, you can see this list of community partners. Greening the Gateway Cities works with a community organization in each city. And it's not always a land trust or a conservation organization. It could also be a public health organization, economic development. So they go to people who know the communities and know the needs, and then work with those groups both to reach out to landowners and business owners to give them these free trees. And also those community groups have a contract to take care of the trees for the first 2 years. So even if there's a really big drought or something, we get them sort of past that hump and established. So this is a program that Steve and I have been a huge fan of for a long time. It's just a really great example. And the carbon benefits not only come from those trees sequestering and storing carbon, but also the energy reductions in the buildings that they now shade and windbreak as they grow bigger. So Steve, I will hand things over to you to kind of talk about the policy context and all the great things that are in the work that are going to get us up to scale and up to speed with natural climate solutions.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Laura. And I remember when the Greening Gateway Cities program was being created, Senator Eldridge's good friend, Senator Pacheco, called it the Energy Trees program. So there's a nice long history of collaboration with Senate colleagues. So I want to talk a bit about how law and policy influences our ability to foster and work on natural and working lands. So when you think about the overall big frame, the Next Gen RoadMap bill made a pretty significant change in the way we think about greenhouse gas emissions, because it changed the goal from an 80% reduction by 2050 from 1990 levels to net zero. It also changed the way that we think about nature. Under the old law, we only counted the emissions that came off the land. Sequestration was not counted. In this new law that strives to achieve net zero, sequestration is counted. And that's because sequestration will be used to help achieve net zero when we reduce emissions, because there will always be something left over that we need to sequester. But it's not, as Laura said, it's not getting people off the hook. It's not getting emitters off the hook. It's making up the difference. And there's so much carbon in the atmosphere anyway. I think we're up to 400 plus parts per million. We're supposed to be at 350. We need natural climate solutions regardless of what the law says. So when we think about the big frames and the big buckets where we need to gain ground in decarbonization, it's really about decreasing energy demand. And we do that by increasing efficiency in buildings and with the vehicles and with appliances. And the next gen bill touches upon all of those. It's also about switching fuels, about switching from fossil fuels to electricity that's powered by fossil-free renewables. It's about increasing the amount of renewable energy that we use to power our energy supply. And there's a 40% requirement under the Renewable Portfolio Standard for renewables by the year 2030. There's also very large-scale procurements for offshore wind because we are the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. There's also an increase in sequestration called for in this bill. So these are really the pillars of sequestration, and these are reflected in the Commonwealth's planning process. During the time this bill was moving through the legislature, there was a parallel planning process that was being conducted by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And Laura and I partnered with a number of other conservation NGOs to lead the Land Use and Nature-Based Solutions Working Group that was part of the State Climate Council that has the wonky name of the Implementation Advisory Committee. So EEA worked and hired consultants to do a decarbonization roadmap study. They were basically looking at what we need to do to decarbonize Massachusetts by 2050. They looked at 8 different scenarios: population, demographics, the economy, the weather, a whole wide range of things that influence the amount of energy demand we would have. And then they looked at pathways to help us reduce greenhouse gases and decarbonize our economy. That's the study up to 2050. But the law, the old law, required that there be a plan for every 10 years. And that's the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that set forth the most compelling or the most meaningful actions that we can take in policy between now and 2030. So that plan was, and the roadmap study were put out in December 2020, as was the climate bill. So guess who didn't get a vacation? The legislators and the policymakers. So the Clean Energy and Climate Plan was out for public comment until March 22nd. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more here. So we've been down this road before in Massachusetts with climate planning, with climate legislation. So it's really important to think about what was different this time. And there really were some quite significant different things. And it was really fostered by folks who were working on climate justice and environmental justice. And there was a lot of collaboration with them on the Next Gen bill and also in the planning process. And our working group and the others on the Climate Council collaborated with the Climate Justice Working Group, and we came up with a set of principles by which we want the Commonwealth to develop and implement climate policy. We want, the principles included: prioritize and anchor equity and justice, support a people-centered approach, take a holistic approach. It's not just about the energy. Use the best available science, technology, and data. Support partnerships and collaboration. Too many times we just focus on the relationship between state and municipalities. NGOs and partners are so important. And ensure that we're being consistent in our efforts to be resilient, adapt, and mitigate. We don't want those working at cross purposes. So the plan was out on the street, and EEA just held its last Climate Council meeting on Monday. And because of the changes to the law, And because of the extensive comments EEA received, they just announced that they're extending the planning horizon on the 2030 plan until June 2022. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So this gives you a synopsis of some of what was heard. And the beauty of this is a call to action for you all. This is a call to action for Elders Climate Action, for the Mass Climate Action Network, and people who want to have input, because EEA realized it can't just rely on the advisory council. It needs to have a more robust stakeholder engagement. So put on your seatbelts and get ready to go. Another thing that was new that happened is the Nature Conservancy and our partners led an effort to make sure that the Next Gen Roadmap bill included language that really required EEA to double down on natural and working lands. It required EEA to do a baseline. What's the current status? It requires EEA to set a goal for emissions and storage. And it requires EEA to develop a plan and to do stakeholdering to inform that plan. And that plan will inform policy, it will inform programs, and it will give stakeholders a chance to have input. So there's another opportunity for you all. This will be separate from the revision of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. So I always like ending with this quote from Christiana Figueres. She's been involved in global climate change. I'll just give you a second to read that and digest that. So basically the message is we can't achieve our climate goals without nature. So that ends our presentation, and we totally appreciate the opportunity to present today. Thank you very much, Senator Eldridge. And we're more than happy to have a dialogue with folks and hear questions. And I think it probably makes sense for me to stop sharing the slides. And if people do want me to go back to a slide, I can do that. We will send the slides off to folks as a PDF document so you have them. But why don't we open it up for questions?
Terrific. Well, Steve, thank you so much. Laura, thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation. Again, great to see so many folks in the webinar, both constituents and people across the state who are environmental or climate change leaders. And I do want to thank my legislative aid and environmental policy advisor, Immaculate Mchomi, who's helped do a lot of the prep for this and helping run the webinar. And so we already received a few questions, and I'm going to take senatorial privilege and ask a question that I had that I know, Steve, you and I have had a couple of back and forths about, and this really came from my going to the Harvard Conservation Coffee, the Concord Conservation Coffee, so all these longstanding environmentalists, and you talked a lot about the process that's been ongoing for a couple of years, and it sounds like it's going to go a couple more years, is in terms of the nature-based solutions provisions, and often the conversation at the local level, especially with conservation trust, is could there be financial incentives for cities and towns to protect open space, and therefore moving forward on nature-based solutions? So I'm just wondering what your view is on what essentially the executive branch process is in looking at that in terms of the provision that you work so hard on to become law.
Absolutely, and I'll invite Laura to augment whatever I add here. So there's already a very robust suite of programs in Massachusetts where state agencies fund municipal and land conservation trust activity through grants, through technical assistance, through support. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we're talking about adding carbon sequestration to the equation in policy. But because of all the great activities that are happening with conserve, protect, restore, and manage already in Massachusetts, we are already getting those carbon sequestration benefits, even if they're not being called out in policy, even if they're not being counted towards our goals. It's important to acknowledge that
Mhm.
people can do this work now. And whether it's working with your land trust to help acquire a local land, whether it's working with your local farmers to help them adopt some best management practices that are highlighted in the Healthy Soils Action Plan that's going to be released later this month, or whether it's working on a restoration project. Senator Eldridge, you were so key in getting the dam loan fund established in Massachusetts, where now over 70 dams have been removed in Massachusetts, and it's helped restore aquatic systems. So that's I'd say we already have these opportunities to do this work. The policy is meaningful, but it doesn't mean that we have to wait.
Yeah, and
That's,
sorry, go
Laura.
ahead.
No, go
I
ahead.
I was just going to say that, yeah, that I agree, Steve. And I was looking at the district boundaries, Senator, before I got on this call, and I was like, oh, you've got Sudbury Valley trustees, you've got New England Forestry Foundation. I mean, you have a lot of real powerhouses here who I agree with Steve. I think the mechanisms are there. Sometimes the funding isn't quite what it could be to take advantage of that potential. And I know that all of us in the land trust communities have been sort of watching what's happened with the sudden move out of cities. You know, there are places that are facing development pressure and really, really, really inflated, very high prices that didn't have them before. So that's certainly a sort of near term, you know, it just makes it all the more urgent that the groups that are working to do that open space land protection, you know, we gotta we gotta step it up a little bit and take advantage of all the tools and all the funding sources that we have.
Absolutely, and I will say to both of you on the sort of talking about increasing funding, is that yesterday the Clean Energy Caucus, which I serve as the Senate chair of, we had a presentation from EEA Secretary Theorides on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, TCI, and talking about, once it's fully implemented, even just with the three states, it could bring about $160 million a year in revenue for the state, if you will, for climate resiliency, is, possibly, prioritizing that money to protect open space and therefore further, nature-based solutions policies. So that was an interesting idea in presentation. And I promise I didn't set this up, but just on the revenue front, I figure I should mention a new bill that I filed that I know the Nature Conservancy is familiar with. It's the HERO Coalition bill, Housing Environment Revenues Options, which is a deeds excise fee that would raise $150 million for climate resiliency and then $150 million for affordable housing, speaking to the fact that, communities, many in my district, which are MVP communities, but they are looking for more state funding to take stronger actions around climate resiliency. So hopefully that can be helpful too if it passes.
We could do a whole webinar on climate funding. There's so many efforts. You can't swing a stick without hitting a climate funding advocate at the State House right now.
We'll plan that for next month. That's right.
That sounds great.
There were some questions that came in before we began, which is terrific. So I'm gonna ask them to Steve and Laura. The first is from Karen Herther, and the question is, which is a great one: are flower and vegetable gardens and outdoor shrubs greenery also effective as nature-based solutions, along with trees and forests, to help remove carbon from the environment?
Yeah, and I'm happy to take that one. I would say yes. So one of the reasons we come back to that, a role for every acre, is that sometimes I think people, they see the natural climate solutions and they immediately want to do, what's the climate smart-est? Like, if these are all climate smarts, or what's the thing that's at the top? And really that depends on where you are. So I wouldn't suggest that someone take an acre of mature forest and turn it into a vegetable garden for carbon sequestration. That would be counterproductive. However, the things that people do on their lawns and in their gardens definitely are sequestering carbon into the soil. And Steve already mentioned a great resource that's coming out, and I think later this month is a little optimistic, Steve. I believe it's supposed to be out June 1st, so maybe next month or at the end of next month. But it's called the Healthy Soils Action Plan. And Steve mentioned that. It's a really good resource with a number of sort of best practices for things from turf grass to suburban lawns to forests to wetlands. And it really focuses on the idea of adding carbon into the soil. So for long-term carbon storage. So if you've got, an area that's just grass and you turn it into shrubland and flower gardens, I would say for the most part, that is something that's going to have, a small but meaningful impact in terms of carbon sequestration, for sure.
Great, thanks, Laura. The next question from Susan Thomas, that she is most interested in learning how municipalities can develop carbon footprint / environmental services models to implement local roadmap plans.
That's a really good question. And I know the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or the RPA that covers this region, has a climate and clean energy playbook that has an inventory toolkit that folks can use. ICLEI, which is an international climate organization, also has a toolkit, and the Mass Climate Action Network, which I believe is an affiliate of ICLEI, is a local resource that has some toolkits and things that folks can use to measure and to take action at the local scale on reducing emissions. I know in Acton we have Green Acton, and it sounded like there were some other groups as well. So I think looking locally is important as well.
Yeah, and Steve and I are from Acton. Talking about Green Acton is I know that last year at town meeting was passed a climate emergency resolution, and I know I've worked with Green Acton this year, including filing another bill that Immaculate did a lot of work on, that is looking to put moratorium on new fossil fuel infrastructure and electrifying buildings, schools, homes in Acton. Both the North Acton Fire Station and the twin elementary schools are mostly going to be powered by geothermal or solar, which is great to see. So it is possible at the local level to do these sort of things. And the third question, then I welcome folks to add questions in the chat, which I know are already coming in. I'll ask those in a bit. But the third question we got before is from Elizabeth Graywolf. What is being done to slow or counter the ongoing development of massive upscale high-rise commercial and condo buildings that are creating massive highway congestion, air pollution in the Cambridge, Boston area with no greening offsets? So we have people from outside the district asking questions, which is great. So I don't know if
that's a good question. I'm not so expert in this area, but I would say it's really up to local zoning. And I know that there are some activists who are working on ensuring that local zoning ordinances and bylaws will help ensure that things are done in a more environmentally preferable fashion. And I also think that MAPC would be another good place to turn. There are a lot of zoning experts there that I often turn to when I need advice on zoning legislation, but I know they have people who do on the ground work there. And the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs has a smart growth toolkit. I know this isn't the most satisfactory answer, but not being an expert in the area, I thought I'd try to turn you to some folks who are.
Great, thanks, Steve. And we have already, as I said, some questions through the chat. The first one is from Arnie Epstein, who part of Elders for Climate Action. We've met many times last session on the Next Generation Roadmap bill. His question is on the potential for sequestration in 2050 and whether sequestration can be used to meet the 2030 limit in the Next Generation Roadmap law.
That sounds like a good Laura question.
The first one, I think I understand what you're asking. So the potential for carbon sequestration in Massachusetts in 2050 across the natural climate solutions that the Nature Conservancy studied in 2018 is 1 to 2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So I don't know. That's in addition to what we're doing now. So that's additional carbon sequestration, provided that we act in all these ways that, Steve and I just mentioned to sort of maximize what nature can do for us. Whether sequestration could be used to meet the 2030 limit. I'm going to look sideways on my screen at Steve, but my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, is that for 2030, sequestration cannot be used to meet that limit. That is a emissions reduction limit separate from that, and that sequestration counting comes in as we get to that 2050 net zero goal, as opposed to the 2030 interim one. I'm hoping I got that right, Steve.
I think the law may be silent on that, but I think it's a matter of policy. And I think the people I've spoken with who are making the policy are looking toward 2050 to have sequestration be added in the calculation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And Laura, I think one thing you have always told me, that currently Massachusetts natural and working lands are currently absorbing 5 million metric tons, correct? And more or less
4 to 5. Yep. Between. Yep.
And that's about 7% of the emissions that we generate every year. So if you go back to the net zero slide, you see that the state has a goal of reducing emissions by 85% by the year 2050. So there's going to be a 15% difference. So it doesn't appear that we will be able to achieve that 15% difference within the Commonwealth. So the question is, how do we design policy that makes sense, that from a science-based perspective, from a fiscal perspective, and from a policy perspective, that doesn't let polluters off the hook and doesn't harm environmental justice communities by enabling pollution in neighborhoods that have been historically impacted by polluting facilities. So it's a really complicated question. I think the law set up the enabling conditions, it set up a framework, but this is going to be a major, major dialogue that needs to happen in Massachusetts. And I hope and encourage that it be a broad-based stakeholder process as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve and Laura. There is a question regarding state forests, and I know this has been a bit of a sensitive issue out in Western Mass around the cutting of trees in state forests, and I guess probably to the point of forestry management. And I'm thinking this might be a question for Laura. Is just, I don't know if you have thoughts, or the Nature Conservancy looking at the discussion around some concerns, especially I think out in Western Mass, about too many trees being cut down in state forests or forestry management. So I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. And for context, I'll say that, today I'm presenting to you guys, and yesterday I was talking about the ins and outs of carbon modeling with foresters, so there's strong opinions on all parts of this issue. I'm going to borrow a phrase that my colleague Mark Anderson coined, that I've been shamelessly using ever since. It's very important not to reduce forests just to carbon, and particularly not to reduce them just to the carbon that's standing on them now. But my colleague Mark says that saying that forests are only good for carbon is like saying that humans are only good because we're good. We have a lot of calcium in us. I mean, it's just one element and it's one piece. And so the Nature Conservancy's position has not been to press for a cutting moratorium on state forest lands for a variety of reasons, including that we think there's a lot of values of forests, from recreation to wildlife habitat to restoration, that sometimes require cutting. We also have experience from our own preserves. We've had places that were probably pretty poorly managed in the past before we got them. They've been sitting there for 40 years. they're not on the track that we thought they would be. They're in need of restoration, and in some cases that is going to require some cutting. We also use a lot of wood here, and we import almost all of it. And while it's a very tiny amount that comes from within any Massachusetts forest anyway, we also don't necessarily want to be pushing that off to places that are less able to advocate for stopping cutting in their areas. That said, this is a tricky issue because the places that we all walk and enjoy are meaningful to us on many levels. And I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of different values at play here. The science does not support stopping cutting every single place, but that is of little consolation if this is the place where you took your kids for hikes and where you go bird watching, and all of those things I think are important, and we just need to be honest about this being a challenging issue and clear about which of those values we're talking about. So hopefully that's at least a partial answer.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the very thoughtful answer, because I know that there have been a lot of folks, again, a lot from Western Mass that have made many trips into the State House on a couple of bills around this. So I really appreciate that perspective. Sort of related, and not to get the Nature Conservancy to tackle these often politically hot potatoes around solar versus protecting trees or forests. I know this was another issue, again, Western Mass, but also in this area. And actually the questions from a neighbor of mine, Niana Tobin, about how do people measure, or how should we measure the benefit of older trees compared to solar in terms of doing our part to combat climate change.
Yeah, so in a minute, Steve, I'm going to kick things back over to you to talk about siting, just the work that we've done on that. But this one is also tricky. If we were having this conversation, I don't know, a decade from now, at sometime in the future, I do think we're going to get to the point where we have to make trade-offs, right? I mean, part of the problem of climate change being the fact that we didn't do anything in 1970, 80, 90, 2000, like we don't have perfect solutions anymore, and we have to make some tough choices. That said, we also at this point have some alternatives to putting large solar farms in forests. And so TNC has weighed in on this issue. And I'm going to let Steve kind of explain how we've tried to express our opinion that there are certain places that maybe aren't appropriate in our mind, aren't the best sites for solar, and others that are. So Steve, if you wouldn't mind.
No, I don't mind at all. So the way that policy position has manifested itself is within the state's incentive program under the Renewable Portfolio Standard called the SMART program. And this is a program that is part of an entire suite of renewable energy efforts to meet percentage goals that require utilities to buy renewable energy from generators. So the generators are desperately trying to meet that need, and the state wants to support them to meet that need. So there are financial incentives to build renewable energy facilities, and there's been a lot of work to try to make sure that's done well. And one of the ways that the Nature Conservancy and our partners have weighed in with the Department of Energy Resources is we have said, gee, why don't we have some areas that are designated as no-go areas where there will not be state incentives for solar energy facilities? And why don't we use the incentives to try to drive solar development to the built environment, to have the canopies on parking lots, to have solar built on buildings, to have it in areas that are already developed. So there's a tiered structuring of the incentives that provide more incentive for solar facilities that are developed in the built environment and fewer incentives for solar facilities in green fields. And those are the green fields where it's allowed, the incentives are allowed. There's a whole wide range of places where the incentives are not allowed. And this is codified into the Department of Energy Resources regulations. There's a very similar approach to hydropower, but we're not, we're talking more about the natural climate solutions part, but that's been our approach. We know that the development is coming. We know the state wants to incentivize it. And rather than throwing up our hands and say, stop, we say, let's do this with the best available science. Let's do this in a way that informs the siting and the operation of these facilities, and even the fuel that comes to the facilities and the way it's transmitted. And it's still not perfect. But our laws and regulations and programs are held up as models throughout the country. The Nature Conservancy recently produced a report talking about different ways different states foster renewable energy. And our SMART program was held up as a model. Although it's not perfect, it's one way to approach it that helps reduce the impact. And I like using the phrase environmentally preferable because I don't think there's anything that's environmentally friendly. It's an environmentally preferable approach.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Laura. Appreciate that. Question from Jen Boudry, good Green Jobs ally from Marlborough. And something I think, Steve, you and I have talked about a little bit, but how is information about open space protection resources or funding distributed to landowners and local officials? What would be your advice for that?
That's a good question. This might be a tag team approach with Laura. I think that there are people who work for municipalities whose job it is to think about natural resource conservation. There are also so many great partners out there like Sudbury Valley Trustees, the New England Forestry Foundation, and others who work with private landowners to try to provide those suite of incentives that municipalities and state agencies provide to make it economically feasible for somebody to conserve their land. And there are several ways to do that. A landowner can outright sell their land to a conservation trust or a municipality or a state agency, or the landowner can put a conservation restriction on it and continue to own the land, but have their activity restricted to things that won't harm the land in the long term. So those are some of the things that I can think of off the top of my head, and I welcome Laura to offer any to augment that, or if we're good, we're good.
No, I think that was great. I think the only on the landowner side, what you said is right on, that we are lucky that we have so many land trusts in Massachusetts, from local to state to regional to national, and landowners are approached with messages about conservation very often. If they enroll in the Chapter 61 program, if they have a service forester come out to their land, if the land trust that's local is interested in their land for ecological or other reasons, they'll reach out. So there's that proactive outreach, as well as a whole slew of professionals within UMass Amherst Extension and others who try to get that out. That said, for some of we've encountered this when we've worked on wildlife habitat, wildlife corridors. The people who have like a lot of land, they've got 100 acres out in Western Mass and it's got gorgeous forest on it, they're going to have heard this message. But sometimes those places that are maybe smaller, it's a pinch point for wildlife movement, it's a restoration case, they may not have been reached as much. And so there's also a lot of efforts to identify those areas. We're doing it around connectivity. Do those landowners know that if they're interested in conservation, that there's someone willing to work with them? So there's definitely more room to go. And I think the same probably holds for agriculture. You've got a big productive farm, you're going to hear about the agricultural preservation restriction program. But if you have a small little urban farm, that there's certainly more that we can do to get that information out there.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Steve. Another great question from Arnie Epstein. As Steve, as you had mentioned in your presentation, the clean energy climate plan has been delayed. We want to do community outreach now. Is there a presentation we can use to inform residents and town officials about what they should be doing and planning for us to meet the 2030 limit?
I'll answer that in two parts. Nice to see you, Arnie. So one part is when EEA presented its update on the Clean Energy and Climate Plan to the Implementation Advisory Committee on Monday, they provided a slide deck that talked about their path forward. They talked about what they need to do to revise the Clean Energy and Climate Plan based on the public comments they received and based on the changes in the law. Then they also had a slide or two on the no regrets actions that they can take regardless of whether or not the plan is done. That's the big state policy frame. So if you want to remain engaged, there are ways to do that. And I'll send that slide deck to Immaculate, who can share it with people after the presentation. It's on, you can find it on the EEA Global Warming Solutions Act website, but I'll just send it along. But if I'm understanding your question correctly, Arnie, there are so many programs related to natural and working lands and to reducing emissions from transportation, from buildings, and from electricity, where municipalities and local folks can engage and collaborate with state agencies who have resources, that the world is really your oyster. The Mass Climate Action Network has some great resources to share. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council has great resources to share. So there are groups out there that play a different role than the Nature Conservancy that help create those links. We do it a little bit, but there are other groups who have a broader menu approach. So MAPC and NCAN are two of those groups that can help you. Did that answer your question?
It did partially, and I was at the IAC meeting on Monday, and
okay.
What we're looking for is something that has the, I don't know what to call it, the imprimatur of the state behind it to say, look, guys, you know, to our select board, to our planning board, to the residents of Stowe, you know, in particular in Stowe, we've got 3 fairly large developments in the work. And we want to, you know, do what we can to encourage the developer to do high efficiency all electric homes. If we had a released CECP with, you know, the state stamp on it, I think that would give us, you know, a big club to wield.
I kind of look at the CECP as a bridge and not the actual policy, because there's nothing enforceable about the CECP. It's not regulations. It's aspirational. So I think looking at I think the state right now is looking at revising the Mass Environmental Policy Act. MEPA is the broad-based umbrella that's used as a framework when a project either gets state funding, or there's a state permit, or there's some other state role. And right now the state is looking at revising MEPA to take emissions, environmental justice, and climate adaptation into account. And that process is going to roll out this summer. There is going to be a lot of stakeholdering to help set up the frame. Then the state will propose revised MEPA regulations and policies. There are all these adjuncts to MEPA that are policies that have meaning, where the developer has to answer questions, and the state may not have a role in enforcing, but those questions inform what local permitting authorities can do. So those inform what the CONSCOM can do, what the Board of Health can do. So I think if you're looking for a broad-based state tool, and you're looking to influence change that can be that badge that you hold in front of the municipality, look toward this revision of MEPA that's happening over the summer and through the fall. The summer is the stakeholdering on what the frame should be. The fall is the actual regulatory comments, from what I understand.
Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Arnie. Another question from Jen Brugge around community farms. There's been strong interest in creating community farms in Massachusetts in recent years to protect farmland and communities. What resources are dedicated to helping locals do this?
I'm going to pump that one. So I am not an agriculture expert, so I tend to just point to the ones who are. You know, if you were in Western Massachusetts a little more, I'd point you towards Kestrel Land Trust or Franklin Land Trust, both of which do great work with working lands. There's also a really powerful organization called the Northeast Organic Farming Association, the Mass chapter, NOFA Mass. They were part of the Healthy Soils Action Planning process. It's the first time I'd really engaged with them. And I mean, they were on top of it. They had, when we were talking about different policies, they had sort of figured out how much it would cost to rent equipment to help farmers plant cover crops, which is one of the natural climate solutions. They're really good. So unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise. And to some extent, it's not TNC's area of expertise in this state. But I'd say that NOFA Mass, the Healthy Soils Action Plan, New England Food Vision, as well as those local land trusts that focus on working lands like Franklin and Kestrel would be your best bet.
And I think Trustees of Reservations does a little bit of work on ag as well, and they're statewide, and they're very well resourced.
Thank you both. And I know as a similar question around farms, and I would just direct Maya and Baron for Elders for Climate Action to those resources that Laura and Steve mentioned around farming practices. So I won't ask that question. And let's see, there's another question from Jen Boudry. Is there a link to the final version of the climate law signed by Governor Baker so the bill is readable? I guess that might mean a layperson's explanation of the law. So Steve, do you have any recommendations on that?
WBOR-FM did a really nice summary of the law, a section by section summary of the law. I would not recommend trying to read the law. Oftentimes when a law is written, it's amending existing law. So you need to do a cross-reference to existing law. And it's a recipe for a headache. So I would say we'll send the link to Immaculate for the WBUR article that has the really nice summary. But the one thing about the WBUR summary is they didn't include natural and working lands, even though Laura did a interview there like months ago.
They need to make a correction of that, Steve. Jeez.
I know.
I think at this point I don't see any more questions on the chat, but I think we're going to stop the recording.